The German invasion of Poland in 1939 is generally considered to represent the beginning of the Second World War, and an enduring image of that invasion was the Polish lancers on horseback bravely but hopelessly charging German tank formations only to be cut to pieces. But it turns out that that well-known story is, well, false. The truth is somewhat different, but no less heroic and no less interesting. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The legend of the Polish Lancers seems to be traceable to a single event on the first day of the war. Poland had some significant disadvantages when it came to defense. The Polish state had ceased to exist in 1795, and while independence movements existed in the interim, it wasn't until 1918 that a Polish state again existed and faced the complicated and difficult task of defending itself. The new state built a large army, but failed to modernize or supply it adequately. The country was mostly concerned with the threat of the Soviets, who they saw as the primary danger. In 1934, Germany and Poland made a joint declaration of non-aggression. A similar declaration was made by the Soviets in 1932. Despite the supposed peace, Poland made plans for its own defense. It wasn't until after 1935 that they began to turn their attention to a war with Germany, and a plan for a defensive war which they dubbed Plan West. But the Poles realized they lacked the necessary supplies to fight Germany in a 1935 assessment. Poland's army consisted of 10.5% antiquated cavalry units, compared to the German 2.1% and the Soviet 6.2%. Polish historian Dr. Walter Drewniecki wrote in 1989 that in 1935 the Polish war machine had an unusually high percentage of infantry and cavalry and a relatively low percentage of air, artillery, tank, and other services. Polish forces had only 4 light guns per infantry battalion, compared to Germany's 8 or more, and no anti-tank guns. They had fewer machine guns, and the supply columns were not mechanized. And what few tanks they had were organized in small battalions or smaller companies, and their tanks were largely designed for reconnaissance. Polish radio units were largely equipped with radios bought from the French after World War I. They had only a few hundred out-of-date planes. So the Polish command moved quickly to try and modernize its forces. Financial constraints meant that the Polish forces remained behind the average European army, but by 1939, 9 new reserve divisions had been formed, and infantry divisions were equipped with new 37mm Bofors anti-tank guns and 7.9mm anti-tank rifles. Most also received 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns and medium artillery. Further improvements were planned for 1940 and 1941. They were armed with relatively modern automatic rifles and heavy machine guns, as well as mortars, although in lesser numbers than their German counterparts. Polish forces also introduced a number of light tanks, including British Vickers tanks that they had manufactured in Poland under the name Light Tanks 7TP, as well as other 7.5-ton light tanks. Poland lacked the money and industry to solve their issues with armor, however, and was simply unable to form armored divisions or large numbers of mechanized brigades. Instead, the tanks were assigned to support infantry divisions. They were unable to purchase tanks, and instead had to make do with the 7TPs and the light reconnaissance tankettes, TK and TKS. A small number of these had 20mm cannons. The Poles had developed their own 155mm howitzers. However, they were only approved for production in 1939, and only 2 prototypes had been built. The Poles had hoped to mechanize their cavalry units, but by 1939 were able to only fully mechanize one and partially mechanize a second. Cavalry, of course, was no longer seen as especially effective on horseback, but instead were used as mobile infantry. And during the 1930s, they'd been upgraded with new weapons, including anti-tank rifles. They were reinforced with an armored group of 13 tankettes and 8 armored cars, and 7 of the 11 brigades received an infantry battalion. The Polish cavalry only stopped being issued lances in the 1930s, although they were retained for training purposes. A number of modern French tanks were given to the Poles, and a battalion worth of them arrived in July 1939, too late to be of much use. Germany could also commit greater manpower to the war, including some 66 divisions, along with 3 Slovakian divisions to Poland's 39. Germany had around 2,800 tanks, mostly the light armored Panzer I and II, along with Czech 35 and 38Ts. Smaller numbers of Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs were also used, and by any measure the Poles were at a significant disadvantage. After staging a series of false flag attacks on itself, Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, simultaneously from the north, south, and west. They were supported by Slovakian forces across the Slovak border. Polish forces had been deployed as far west as possible along the border to protect Poland's population and industry in Upper Silesia, but lacked good defensive positions and were stretched thin. Polish defensive plans relied heavily on the promise that France and England would attack Germany quickly. By 8 a.m. on September 1st, German troops had crossed the western border and engaged Polish forces near the village of Mokra. Polish cavalry of the 21st Vistula Uhlans were defending the village dismounted, were able to make an able defense against the Panzer Is and IIs using their anti-tank rifles, supported by an armored train. The cavalry brigade held off the German division for 10 hours. German forces were moving elsewhere as well, especially in the Polish corridor that was given to Poland to give it a shoreline on the Baltic Sea, and which separated the greater part of Germany from East Prussia and the free city of Danzig. In the way was the Polish Pomeranian Army, which had 5 infantry divisions, 2 volunteer national defense brigades, and 1 cavalry brigade. The region was dominated by the Chola Forest, which Polish high command thought was good defensive ground. There were several reasons why the area was not as good a defensive position as the command thought. German forces had regularly held military exercises there until 1919, and General Heinz Guderian, who commanded the 19th Panzer Corps, had actually been born nearby. The Germans were also able to pressure the corridor from 2 directions. The army's commander, Władysław Bortnowski, thought the position was untenable, had repeatedly requested the position be abandoned. From the west, the German Second Army, supported by the 19th Panzer Corps, crossed the border on September 1st, while the 21st Corps of the Germans' Third Army attacked from East Prussia. By 9 a.m., German forces were engaging Polish forces at the Berda River. In some places, Polish forces were able to delay German units. Polish defenders destroyed 2 Panzer IIs with their 37mm anti-tank guns. They also managed to torch the bridge that was Guderian's primary target. Polish units at Gostycin held off German elements the whole first day, only withdrawing after midnight. Polish forces also fortified the Reitel position, which German units attempted to assault across marshy ground, leading to heavy casualties. The fight, however, was desperate, and German forces were advancing quickly against Polish units that were too small in number to defend the region. Bortnowski had left an independent group to defend the transportation hub at Hornice, which included 3 infantry battalions and 3 light artillery brigades. The Germans attempted to seize the train station with an armored train called Panzerzug III, one of 4 used in the invasion. It arrived to release German infantry, but was soon targeted by Polish artillery, which destroyed the command turret and killed the commander. The train attempted to retreat, but was trapped on a bridge where it was destroyed. Most of the defenders were National Defense volunteers and were too few to fully defend the city, but they continued to hold off German forces until 2 p.m. They were ordered to withdraw as motorized German infantry threatened to encircle them, withdrawing to the northeast. It was at this time that the scene was set for what would become one of the most enduring myths of World War II and the German invasion of Poland. Detached from a Pomorska cavalry brigade, the 18th Regiment of Pomeranian Uhlans were ordered to support the withdrawal. Uhlans are traditionally light cavalry armed with a lance, which was first created by Lithuania's irregular cavalry units. They grew out of a cavalry unit made up of Tatars who served the Lithuanian army. Through the 18th century, smaller units called Uhlans or Lancers were formed in most European armies. Lance-armed cavalry were still in use in 1914 when the German Imperial Army had 26 Uhlan regiments. Polish Uhlans who fought in conflicts after World War I included the Greater Poland Uprising, Polish-Ukrainian War, and Polish-Soviet War. Though they were not trained as traditional cavalry by World War II, they did retain sabers. The 18th Pomeranian Uhlans were ordered to slow the motorized infantry in a counterattack with at least 2 cavalry squadrons. The Uhlans discovered a group of Germans who were disorganized, apparently at rest in the open and not expecting a counterattack. Kazimierz Mestelich, the unit's commander, ordered a cavalry charge into the German infantry. Sabers drawn, some 200 Polish cavalry charged in a successful, if anachronistic, display that broke the German unit. The Polish cavalrymen described a different charge similarly. The Germans dispersed before us, tried to set up their machine guns. Loose shots were fired, and strangest of all, there was total panic among the Germans. It proved that even in modern warfare, the pounding hooves of horsemen bearing down on infantry could still inspire fear. If it seemed like a victory, things quickly changed. A Polish eyewitness described the ensuing disaster. Suddenly, enemy tanks came out of hiding, charging our flank with a drumfire barrage. The squadrons instantly scattered towards the nearby wooded height, a good anti-tank position, but did not escape the effects of the armored attack. 25 cavalrymen were killed, including Mestelich, and double that injured. Caught in the open, the cavalry made good targets for the armored cars of the German army. Modern scholars guess that the tanks were actually armored cars, likely Panzersparwagen, reconnaissance vehicles. The attack was not in vain, as it slowed the German advance, allowing the Seirsk operational group to withdraw. The operational group's commander said of the 18th Uhlans that they had etched its name in gold in the pages of history of the Polish cavalry. He decorated the unit with his Virtui Militari, Poland's highest military decoration. The charge was one of 16 confirmed cavalry charges made during the invasion. At least initially, German soldiers took the threat seriously. Guderian himself found some of his own men setting up positions in anticipation of a cavalry charge. The charge would soon take on a much different meaning. Shortly after the battle, the Germans brought in foreign journalists to examine the field, where German tanks now idled, surrounded by the fallen Polish lancers. Numerous correspondents would report back from Poland about the doomed charges of the Polish cavalry against tanks. Indro Montanelli, a famous Italian journalist, wrote back to his newspaper about the bravery and heroism of the Poles. American journalist William Schreier wrote in his Berlin diary that here, the Germans say, a whole division of Polish cavalry charged against hundreds of German tanks and was annihilated. Heinz Guderian himself wrote that the Polish Pomeranian Cavalry Brigade, in ignorance of the nature of our tanks, had charged them with swords and lances and had suffered tremendous losses. Guderian's reference to the Poles being ignorant of the tanks comes down to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which barred the Germans from having tanks, but which the Germans had been ignoring for some time. The idea that the Poles were simply ignorant of Germany's buildup seems unlikely given their preparations in the 1930s. And Guderian also wrote in his memoirs that he received a report of a unit withdrawing in the face of a spirited defense by cavalry. I was speechless for a moment, Guderian wrote. When I regained the use of my voice, I asked the divisional commander if he had ever heard of a Pomeranian Grenadiers being broken by hostile cavalry. That didn't stop dramatic wartime portrayals, and Italian papers like the Sunday Courier are reporting in the Wehrmacht propaganda machines, which used the story to show how sophisticated the Germans were compared to the Poles, writing that Polish propaganda had led the Polish Lancers to believe that the tanks had no real armor. Romantic depictions of the charge abounded, covering magazines like the German youth magazine Der Pimpf. The Germans quickly ran with the story, filming a propaganda movie staging a cavalry charge against German armor. The myth was also popularized and spread by the Soviets, who used it to show that the Polish leadership was reckless with Polish lives, and after the war perpetuated the myth to discredit the Second Polish Republic and its supporters. It was part of the justification for the massacre of Polish officers and intelligentsia by the Soviets in the following year. Reports of the obsolete cavalry charges abounded. The Brisbane-based Courier Mail described the hopeless charge of Polish cavalry against German armored cars, citing the German news agency and writing that it confirmed that the Polish cavalry is helpless against the high firepower of German armored units and aerial machine gunning. The News and Herald of Klamath Falls, Oregon, printed a UP report that Polish cavalry were committing suicide after a gallant but fruitless charge against German machine guns and flamethrowers. Post-war, the myth continued to be supported by some official sources, like the Soviets, while it spread in the scholarship in publications like William Schreier's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, where he wrote horses against tanks, the cavalryman's long lance against the tank's long cannon. Brave and valiant and foolhardy though they were, the Poles were simply overwhelmed. The Poles themselves sometimes spread the myth, latching on to the bravery and sublime heroism of the Poles defending their country. The myth has remained pervasive, has been mentioned over and over. The 1944 movie In Our Time has a character recount his cavalry unit being wiped out by tanks. The acclaimed 26-episode 1973 documentary series The World at War presents the myth as fact. Historian Hanson Baldwin wrote in 1976 of the magnificent horsemen of the Pommer's Cavalry Brigade that died in droves charging German tanks. As recently as 2009, historian Richard Evans wrote the stories were probably apocryphal, and The Guardian published a column describing the charge as the most romantic and idiotic act of suicide in modern war, only to post a retraction soon after. When Jim Cramer parroted the myth in May of 2017, the Polish embassy made a statement calling the reference unnecessary, inaccurate, and insensitive. The 10-part series Greatest Events of World War II in Color, released in 2019, even referenced it, saying, "The Polish army on their horses are no match for the German panzers, but they put up a valiant fight." Some images of the charge even depict winged hussars from more than 200 years before. Despite this myth's pervasive presence, there is no evidence that Polish cavalry ever attempted to charge German armored formations. They actually mostly fought dismounted, although there were some cavalry charges against German infantry. This myth of an archaic and underprepared Polish military served various propaganda purposes at the time, but it seems to have persisted long after it was proven to be false. And while it's true that the Polish military did collapse fairly quickly in the face of an overwhelming attack by both the Germans and the Soviet Union, their military was not as anachronistic as it has been presented to be. And two, horses were used throughout the war. The Germans deployed cavalry throughout the war, but also used horses in logistical purposes. They used as many as 2.7 million horses over the course of the war. And horse cavalry of the Polish People's Army were deployed by the Soviet Union throughout the war. They made a successful charge at the Battle of Schoenfeld in 1945. Well, after the war, most horse cavalry was removed from the world's militaries, but a few, including the United States, keep some horse cavalry around for ceremonial purposes, and horses do occasionally get used in combat, for example, by U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan in 2001. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support the History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo.